Professor Graham Yorston, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Vikings, werewolves and madness from my perspective as a psychiatrist. That's a bit of an odd combination, I hear you say, but stick with it and find out some more about the dark and mysterious internal world of the Vikings. Now, the first problem we have is that there are very few surviving sources actually written by the Vikings themselves. So how do we get inside the Viking mind? There are a few thousand runestones, but the main function of these was to mark territory, to explain inheritance, or to bring glory to dead kinsmen. We do get a glimpse of the Viking mind in some of the stones, however. For example, Vigmund had this stone carved in memory of himself, the cleverest of men. Boasting of one's strength and achievements was very much part of the Viking culture. People have also tried to draw conclusions about what the Vikings thought of themselves from the epithets or nicknames that were attached to them. These can be based on appearance, as in Harold Finehair, Kettle Flatnose, and Swain Forkbeard, or achievements, as in Turf Einar, an Earl of Orkney who introduced the practice of burning turf or peat to the islands, as wood was so scarce. The epithets used for women are also interesting. For example, Aulf the Deep-Minded, who is also known as Un the Wise. She appears in many of the sagas and has been described as a remarkable woman, who illustrates the non-binary gender politics of the Viking Age, in which a person's ability to lead and put bread on the table was more important than their sex. There has been much speculation about the meaning of Ivar the Boneless, one of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, who invaded England with a great heathen army in 865. Was he physically disabled from having brittle bone disease? Was it a euphemism for him being impotent? Or, and this is the explanation I prefer, is his anglicised name a mistranslation of bineless or legless, which is a kenning or metaphor for a snake? The idea of Ivar the Serpent certainly sounds more menacing than the other alternatives. My favourite epithet, though, has to be the name given to another Earl of Orkney, Thorfinn Skullsplitter. I think we can get a sense of what mattered in the Viking world from this name. But apart from these rather tantalising snippets, all we have from the Viking Age itself are descriptions of them by those who are subject to their raids and plundering. Understandably, these accounts emphasise the barbarity and brutality of the Norsemen. In the year 793, the first major Viking raid on Britain took place at Lindisfarne Monastery. It is often said to mark the start of the Viking Age, which was to last for over 200 blood-soaked years. Amazingly, letters from this time have survived. Alcuin of York, a scholar at the court of the Emperor Charlemagne, who was described at the time as the most learned man anywhere to be found. Alcuin wrote to the Bishop of Lindisfarne expressing his deep sympathy, saying, "The pagans desecrated God's sanctuaries and shed the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled the bodies of saints like dung in the street." The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives us more detail about what happened before the raid. "Terrible portents came over the land of the Northumbrians, terrifying the people most woefully. There were immense sheets of lightning rushing through the air, and whirlwinds and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. Fyrna drakan." The account continues. "There followed a great famine, and a little after, the ravaging of wretched heathen men made lamentable havoc in the church of Holy Island by rapine and slaughter." Interestingly, 793 was a year of high sunspot activity, which makes the northern lights particularly vivid, and it has been speculated that the fiery dragons of the chronicle were nothing more than the natural phenomenon of the aurora borealis. As with all ancient sources, though, we have to be careful. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle was begun 100 years after these events, in the reign of Alfred the Great, who had spent most of his life battling against or paying off one Viking invasion after another. Although it aimed to give a comprehensive history of the kings of England dating back to the Roman era and contains lots of descriptions of Viking raids, we must not forget it was written to glorify King Alfred and his line. Nowadays we might think of it as political propaganda at best, or fake news at worst. What about other sources? Well, there are some contemporary Islamic accounts of the Vikings. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab envoy who encountered the Vikings in the 10th century on the river Volga in Russia. He describes Viking ceremonies and some of the rituals associated with the burial of Viking chieftains, including the sacrifice of slaves. He also comments on Viking hygiene, describing them as the filthiest of Allah's creatures. However, Ibn Rusta, a Spanish Arab who actually visited Hedeby in the 10th century, when it was an important Viking trading centre in what is now Denmark, had a different experience. In his account, he describes the Vikings as well-dressed and clean. This demonstrates the difficulties of knowing what to believe when you have conflicting sources of information. It was true 1,000 years ago, and is undoubtedly even more true now. I would say it is one of the most important things about studying history, learning to question your sources. If we wish to know more about the internal psychological world of the Vikings, what they thought, what they felt, what they loved, and what they feared, then we have to rely on the Sagas. One psychiatrist who has studied this literature extensively has said that the Sagas provide almost clinical descriptions of attitudes towards and reactions to mental illness. I have to confess, I love Viking sagas. I started reading Henry Treece books as a boy and have vivid memories of watching Kirk Douglas in The Vikings as it was endlessly repeated on Sunday afternoon television. I moved up to Thor comics as a teenager and graduated to the full Viking sagas as I got older. There are around 60 Norse sagas, tales of the old gods and giants, lives of the kings of Norway, and perhaps the richest and most interesting, the histories of the Icelandic families who left Norway and migrated to Iceland in the 9th century, their voyages around the North Atlantic and onto America, and their incessant fighting and feuding. Many of the characters interconnect in different sagas and are referred to in other historical sources. This is particularly true for the later kings in the King's sagas. They're not fiction, but neither can they be regarded as historically accurate. They were written down mainly in Iceland in the 1200s, and although they describe people and events from the pagan Viking age, they were written down when Iceland was firmly Christian. Linguistic analysis has allowed many of the poetic passages to be traced back much earlier, however. Some are quite brief or fragmentary, but many are novel-length extended pieces of writing that explore the often complex psychological makeup and deeds of famous Viking Age figures. Probably the best-known saga poet was Snorri Sturluson, who was born around 1179. He was also a politician and law speaker in the Icelandic parliament, the Althing. Unfortunately, like many of the characters he wrote about, he died a violent death, murdered in his cellar on the orders of the King of Norway in 1241. He wrote the prose Edda about the old gods, a multi-volume history of the Norwegian kings, the Heimskringla, and a number of Icelandic family sagas. In perhaps the greatest of these, we hear about the life, family and deeds of Egil Skallagrimsson, who is described as a huge, dark, bald man of enormous strength with a murderously bad temper. Was this because he had wolf blood in his veins? He was a fearless fighter who killed for the first time at the age of 6. After suspecting a friend of cheating in a game, he returned to his house, collected his axe, and went back and sunk it into his companion's skull, right down to the jaw. His father wasn't too happy about this, but his mother thought his actions showed he was made of proper Viking stuff. He went on his first Viking raid to modern-day Latvia at the age of 12, and later he bit a man's throat out in a duel over property. As was common, he drank heavily, but so heavily that he almost drowned his host at a feast when he vomited all over him. In truth, he is often portrayed in quite unflattering terms. However, he did have a more sensitive side, and he was a famous poet, writing his first verses at the age of 3. This comes out when his son Bodvar drowns. He is said to have lain down in a cot and accepted neither food nor drink, and have simply wished to die. It has been said that no saga character is more multifaceted or has had as many psychiatric diagnoses proposed to explain his behaviour. These range from bipolar affective disorder, antisocial personality disorder, delirium, dementia, psychosis. I would say, though, that the evidence for these is rather slim. There has also been modern medical speculation on what disease he might have been suffering from to account for his rather unusual appearance. It has been suggested that he had Paget's disease of the bone, which can result in an enormously thickened skull. This is based on his physical description in the saga, but also on an account of what happened when his bones were dug up to give him a Christian burial 150 years later. The skull was an exceptionally large one, and its weight was even more remarkable. It was ridged all over like a scallop shell. The priest wanted to find out how thick it was, so he picked up a heavy axe and struck it as hard as he was able. The skull neither broke nor dented, it simply turned white. Paget's disease can also have psychiatric manifestations due to raised calcium levels, including paranoia, hallucinations and delirium, as well as excruciating headaches due to nerves being squeezed as they leave the thickened skull. Could this have contributed to his famous bad temper? The problem with the theory is, though, that Paget's disease, despite being common in much of Europe, is rare in Scandinavia and Iceland. So another suggestion is that Egil may have had Van Bochum's disease, as his father is also described as being somewhat ugly of feature. This is an exceptionally rare genetic syndrome that results in overgrowth of bone in the face and skull. With so much violence and death in the sagas, there are naturally a lot of grieving relatives. In general, displays of excessive emotion are discouraged as being unmanly, but detailed descriptions of prolonged grief are not uncommon, even in those otherwise considered strong and powerful. King Harald Finehair, portrayed by Peter Frantzen in the TV show The Vikings, was the first leader to become Overking of Norway in the early 10th century. He appears in many different sagas and is said to have loved his wife, Snæfridr, so madly that his kingdom and all his duties he neglected. But then Snæfridr died. The king sat over her continually and thought that she would return to life. So 3 years went by that he mourned her dead, while all the people of the land mourned him astray in his wits. To put down this derangement, Thorleif Spake came to treat him, who, using his intelligence, put down this derangement. The prolonged despair and inaction that he suffered after the death of his wife has been interpreted as a prolonged grief reaction and depressive illness. In the saga, however, it was put down to witchcraft, as his wife's body did not decompose at all in those 3 years, until it was moved, when it suddenly turned blue and started to smell. As a funeral pyre was prepared, toads, snakes and lizards crawled out of her body, and the king is said to have become mistrustful of magic thereafter. Witchcraft and magic appear frequently in the sagas, and it is believed that the magical power of runes was often called upon in Viking medicine. Runes could be used for good or ill. For example, our old friend Egil Skallagrimsson was called in to help heal a sick girl who lay as if paralysed in her bed. He found a whalebone underneath her in the bed, on which runes were carved. Egil shaved off the runes into the fire and scored different runes and laid them under her pillow, and she was instantly healed. If the idea of a lovesick or depressed monarch doesn't match our stereotypical view of the Vikings, then how about a bipolar king? King Sigurd Jorsalfair is a slightly later king from the Christian era who led a Norwegian crusade to Jerusalem. In the saga, he displays erratic behaviour and odd reactions to events which have been interpreted as the mood swings of bipolar affective disorder. For example, at a feast, he asked for a hot bath to be made for him, and when he was in the water, he thought there was a fish gliding around in the bath beside him. Then he had such a great fit of laughter that he seemed out of his mind. And after that, this afflicted him very frequently. When he was in Byzantium, he spent lavishly and squandered the gold and silver he was given by the emperor. On another occasion, he tries to drown one of his own men as he is swimming in the sea beside his ship because of his paranoid beliefs, and he has to be distracted to allow the man to get away. We also hear about episodes of low mood. For example, one morning he was reticent and uncheerful, and his companions feared that his fits had come over him again. Later in life, the king was at times visited by a serious illness, and he had not always the power to control himself. Once, in front of the court, he looked very tired and had a worried countenance. He then said that the two things in life that really mattered now represented the worst of everything, and he threw a precious Bible written in gold letters into the fireplace, and he struck the queen's face as he saw goat's horns coming out of her forehead. I have to say, I think I would want a little more detail before making a diagnosis if I was seeing him in my outpatient clinic. But it does sound as if the Vikings had their fair share of depression and bipolar disorder. But how do we explain the frenzied battle fury of the Berserker warriors? There are many descriptions of Berserkers in the Sagas. They are said to have fought without armour in a trance-like fury, shaking and biting their shields. And this, of course, has given rise to the modern English phrase of going berserk. Scholars remain divided about whether berserk means bare of shirt or sark, which, incidentally, is the same word used by Robert Burns in his Tales of Witches and General Misbehaving in Tam O'Shanter, or bare shirt because they donned animal skins in a shamanistic rite of transformation. Going into battle without armour was not unique to Viking berserkers, however. The Greek historian Polybius said that the Celts calculated to inspire terror in their enemies by tossing their clothing away and moving into the front lines naked except for their weapons. And we know that Germanic warriors, barefooted and bare-chested except for animal skin cloaks, fought for the Roman Emperor Trajan and were honoured by appearing on Trajan's column. Many theories have been proposed as to what may have induced the Berserker State, from alcohol, henbane or stinking nightshade, the seeds of which have been found in Viking Age burials and which contain hyoscyamine, scopolamine and other alkaloids related to atropine and hyoscine, which are still used in medicine today to dilate pupils, for motion sickness and for abdominal spasms, and to dry up the excessive salivation experienced as a side effect with some antipsychotic medication. Bog myrtle, which contains multiple terpenes and tannins and which has been used from everything from flavouring beer, protecting from mosquito bites, to curing acne and procuring abortions. It has also been suggested that the resin is hallucinogenic. Mugwort, which contains thujone, which is present in absinthe, and we all know what that did to poor old Vincent van Gogh. Psychedelic mushrooms, including fly agaric and white agaric. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and which contains ergotamine. This is an alkaloid that is chemically related to LSD and which is known to cause hallucinations and mania. Ergot was a common contaminant in bread in the Middle Ages, and the complex range of neuropsychiatric symptoms it caused was known as St. Anthony's fire. A hospital specialising in treating this condition was established in France in 1095, just after the Viking Age, but its effects were known about much earlier, and it has been found in the stomachs of peat bog bodies sacrificed 1,000 years before the Vikings. The hyperarousal that is one of the core features of post-traumatic stress disorder has also been suggested as the mechanism behind the Berserker frenzy. But perhaps the most unlikely theory is that poisonous toads, specifically the Sonoran desert toad, were somehow linked to the Berserker State. Now, although it is historical fact that the Vikings reached North America, as far as I'm aware there are no sagas describing the Vikings reaching the Pacific Southwest. My own thoughts are that the Berserker frenzy was most likely a self-induced dissociative state, and there are lots of examples of this in other cultures. I should also say at this point that these are all theories. Please don't test them out and try to turn yourself into a berserker, as many of these substances can lead to severe poisoning and death. And I'm sure the toads would rather not be licked, thank you very much. The sagas themselves simply describe the actions of berserkers, often in rather matter-of-fact terms. And it has been said that much of what we think we might know about them is actually from much later speculation. One can imagine that going into a berserker rage would be useful in battle, but somewhat less useful at other times, and there are references in early Scandinavian law books suggesting that an outrageous berserker should either be chained or made an outlaw. And in later sagas, berserkers were portrayed in increasingly negative terms, particularly as they were associated with Odin. Sadly, one of the outcomes for severe mental illness is suicide. Do we find any evidence of this in the sagas? Indeed we do. In King Halfdan's saga, a berserker called Haki ambushes and kills King Sigurd's heart and abducts his daughter Ragnhilda, described as a most splendid woman, to be his wife. However, he loses an arm and sustains other wounds in the fight that leaves him bedridden, and he is unable to consummate the marriage. King Halfdan's men attack and burn down his house at Yuletide and take Ragnhilda and all his possessions. Haki tries to pursue Halfdan's men, but gives up as he arrives at a frozen lake. The saga says, he then turned the hilt of his sword downwards and leaned on the point, so that the sword pierced him through. There he met his death, and he is buried in a mound on the lake shore. People who committed suicide were thought to become restless dead or revenants, not so different to zombies, who could be dangerous to the living. The corpses of suicides and those who died in conflict or anger were treated in various ways to minimise their potential for harm. They were carried out from the house through artificially made passages instead of doorways, in order to lead them astray if they tried to return, and buried far away from human settlement, often close to water and covered with stones. Though the reanimated dead were occasionally benevolent to the living, more often they caused physical and mental harm. In the Eyjabryggja saga, when Thorolf Twistfoot dies, he torments the valley where he lived, killing livestock and shepherds, such that many farms are abandoned. His widow is driven out of her wits, and eventually the strain of it kills her. Eventually his body is removed from his cairn and found to be uncorrupted. It is taken and reburied high up on a ridge, and a high wall built around it. So, finally, it is time to talk about werewolves. In all corners of the world, there are stories about people who have the ability to transform themselves into animals. Usually the largest predatory species of whatever region they are in. However, the only native land mammal in Iceland is the rather cute Arctic fox. So the saga writers have had to rely on folk memories of the wolves and bears of Norway. There are 14 Icelandic sources for werewolves, plus several Norwegian ones, and frequent references to man-bears. It has been argued that the man-wolves in these stories simply put on wolf skins, but linguistic analysis suggests that the early sagas were talking about proper, shape-shifting werewolves. The god Odin was a shapeshifter, and the Ynglinga saga says that when he transformed himself, his body lay as though he were asleep or dead, and he then became a bird or a beast, a fish or a dragon, and he went off in an instant to far-off lands. This ability is echoed in the tales of Bodvar Bjarki, who appears in several sources. His human body was observed quietly sleeping in the hall while a giant bear fought in King Hrolf Kraki's bodyguard on the battlefield. He kills more men with his paw than any 5 of the king's other champions. Blows and missiles glance off him, and he crushes both the men and horses of the enemy. Everything that comes in his way, he crushes in his teeth. But when Bodvar was awakened from his trance, the bear disappears. As a man, Bodvar fought as a berserker, but much less effectively than as the bear. In the Poetic Edda, which contains the oldest Norse poetry, dating back to the 10th century, there are stories of the gods and mythical heroes that Wagner incorporated into his ring cycle. In the Norse version, the hero Sigmund and his son Sinfjotl became werewolves to avenge their dead kingsmen. They find magic wolfskins, and when they put them on, they cannot get them off. They communicate with the wolves and in the language of wolves, and hunt like them. They were able to kill up to 7 men alone, and Sinfjotl once killed 11. After a while the skins came off. They burned them, and thereafter remained in human form, but they had increased battle prowess. The final reference should go to the grandfather of our old friend Egil Skallagrimsson. His name was Ulf Bjalfsson, but he is better known as Kveldulf, which means twilight or evening wolf in Old Norse, as every day as the light faded, he would become so ill-tempered that few could speak to him. He would go to bed early, and it was commonly said that he was a shapeshifter.
So there we are, Vikings, werewolves and madness, with just a few zombies thrown in for good measure. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting. If so, please like and consider subscribing. Also, if you have any comments or suggestions for further videos, please let me know. I've listed the academic and medical sources, but the main sources are the Viking Sagas themselves. These are often very cheap to buy or available as free downloads, and I would wholeheartedly recommend exploring them. But I am slightly biased about that, because I have just a little bit of Viking blood in my veins. Skål!